Back to the Future. Could it actually happen with a real time machine?
In 1997, Mike Markham stepped into a machine he built in his garage and vanished without a trace. Nobody. No answers. Nothing but a burned-out shell and a cryptic note. For 29 years, everyone assumed he was dead. Then he came back. And what he revealed about those missing years will genuinely disturb you. This is not science fiction. Every detail you are about to hear is documented.
It is odd that many of the descriptions of aliens are effectively humanoid, and this raises an interesting possibility. One idea that's been put forward is that these are not extraterrestrials at all, but they're time travelers from the future.
Witnessed and impossible to explain away. Mike Markham grew up in rural Missouri during the 1970s and 1980s. By most accounts, his childhood and early adult years were unremarkable in terms of formal achievement. He did not attend university. He had no professional background in physics, electrical engineering, or any related scientific discipline. What he did have, by all available accounts, was an intense and consuming interest in electricity that started early and never let up. He taught himself the basics from library books. He scavenged components from junkyards, picking up old transformers and wiring that other people had thrown away. In his spare time, and eventually in most of his time, he built things. Anything that could generate a current, throw a spark, or produce a visible electrical arc. By the early 1990s, that self-guided education had taken him somewhere unexpected. At some point during this period, Markham constructed what is known in basic physics education as a Jacob's ladder. It is a straightforward piece of equipment, two metal rods arranged in a V shape with a high voltage current running between them, producing an arc of electricity that climbs upward along the rods before breaking and restarting at the base. It is the kind of device commonly used in school science demonstrations and has no unusual properties under normal operating conditions. Markham, however, was not operating under entirely normal conditions. Working alone one night in his garage, he positioned a cheap laser pointer so that its beam passed directly through the climbing electrical arc. According to his own later account, the effect was immediate and strange. The hum produced by the transformers changed pitch. The arc itself, which is typically erratic and difficult to predict, suddenly tightened and steadied. It behaved, he said, as though it had become intentional, as though something had organized it. And then he noticed something sitting on his workbench nearby. A steel washer. It flickered, not in the way that objects move when disturbed by vibration or airflow. It was simply there, and then for a fraction of a second, it was not there, and then it was back, sitting in exactly the same position it had occupied before. Markham reportedly froze. Then he tried it again. He placed small metal objects between the rods, screws, coins, washers. And on certain attempts, for just a brief moment, they vanished. There was no sound associated with the disappearance, no physical movement, no obvious explanation. The objects were simply absent for a heartbeat and then present. Again, undamaged, unmoved, exactly as they had been. The air in the garage, he later recalled, smelled strongly of ozone. There was another quality to it that he could not easily describe, something that caused the hair on his arms to stand up. He had no framework for what he was seeing. He did not know whether it was a genuine physical phenomenon or some kind of perceptual error on his part. What he was certain of, he would later say, was that it was real, and that he needed someone to confirm he had not lost his grip on reality. In January 1995, Markham picked up the phone and called Coast to Coast AM, the long-running American late-night radio program that had, under host Art Bell, built a substantial audience for discussions of fringe science, unexplained phenomena, and topics that mainstream media generally ignored. Bell was known for his willingness to engage seriously with unusual callers while still pressing them with pointed, skeptical questions. Markham was nervous on the call. He stumbled over his words. He described the device he had built, the effect he had observed, and his inability to explain it. Bell listened and then asked a straightforward question. How did Markham know the objects were actually disappearing, rather than the arc simply creating an optical illusion? Markham's answer was not what Bell appeared to be expecting. He said he knew because he could feel it. When the field produced the right conditions, he said, the atmosphere inside the garage changed in a way that was physically perceptible. The air felt different. It felt In his words, like it was holding its breath. He also noted that he was not the only one responding to whatever the field was producing. His dog refused to enter the garage. Birds had stopped landing on the roof. Something about the environment the device created was causing animals to avoid the space entirely. Bell went quiet for a moment. Then he told Markham to document everything. Get witnesses, record video, footage, and call back. Over the following year, Markham did call back, and what he reported each time was a significant escalation. He was not content with what he had already observed. The flickering of small objects was a starting point, not a destination. He wanted to understand the mechanism behind it, bring it under reliable control, and push it further. Doing that required substantially more electrical power than his existing setup could provide. In the summer of 1995, he made a decision that would temporarily derail his work entirely. He stole 6 industrial transformers from a rural electrical substation and wired them into his garage system. When he switched the system on, it drew enough power to cause a brownout across several nearby properties. Lights dimmed across a quarter-mile radius. Utility company investigators traced the surge directly to Markham's address. He was arrested and served 60 days in a county jail. Those 60 days did not slow him down. He spent the time sketching diagrams and refining his calculations. He walked out of jail more focused than when he had walked in. By late 1995, he had rebuilt his setup using legally purchased components with improved control systems and more precise laser stabilization. When he contacted Art Bell again, Bell later said he noticed something had shifted in Markham's voice. It was darker, quicker, and carried a quality that Bell described as close to desperation. The experiments, Markham told him, had moved well beyond what they had been before. Objects were no longer just flickering for fractions of a second, they were disappearing for full seconds at a time. And when they came back, sometimes something about them was different. Markham described placing a wooden block between the arcs during one of his later sessions. It vanished completely. Not a flicker this time, not a brief absence that could be questioned or second-guessed, but 3 full seconds of nothing. The space where the block had been was simply empty while the transformers hummed and the arc crackled around the gap. When the block came back, Markham picked it up immediately. It was ice cold. Not slightly cool in the way an object might feel after sitting in a draft, but deeply, unnaturally cold, far below the temperature of anything else in the garage. It felt, he said, as though it had been somewhere else entirely, somewhere with a very different climate to a garage in rural Ohio. He ran further tests. He placed a flower between the arcs. It disappeared and returned wilted and completely dried out, as though several days had passed during the seconds it was absent. The physical condition of the objects coming back through the field was telling him something, though he was not yet sure exactly what. Then he conducted a test that shifted the tone of his conversations with Art Bell considerably. He placed a live mouse in a small cage and positioned it between the arcs. The mouse vanished for 5 seconds. When it reappeared. It was alive, but its behavior had changed entirely. It moved in continuous circles, colliding repeatedly with the walls of its cage. It refused food and water. It died 2 days later. Bell's response to this was direct. He told Markham, and there was something audible in his voice at that point, a combination of concern and frustration, that he needed to stop working alone. The experiments had gone beyond what one person operating without oversight in a private garage should be doing. Bell urged him to reach out to scientists, to bring in people with the training and resources to properly assess what was happening. He wanted Markham to work within established structures rather than pushing forward in isolation. Markham went quiet for a moment. Then he said he could not stop. He was too close. In hindsight, that statement was accurate in at least one sense. He was close to something. Whether it was what he believed it to be is harder to say. His final call to Coast AM came in late February 1996. It was the one that made the deepest impression on Bell's regular listeners, many of whom had been following Markham's updates for months. Markham said he had expanded the field significantly. It was no longer limited to affecting small objects placed between the arcs. He had made it large enough to step into himself, partially at first, and what he experienced when he did that was unlike anything he had previously described. Time felt different inside the field. That was how he put it. Everything around him appeared to slow down while he remained at normal speed, or what felt like normal speed. He could see events unfolding in a kind of extended slow motion. He could move, he said, in the spaces between seconds. And when he stepped back out, he found that more time had passed in the room than he had experienced inside the field. The duration he had perceived while standing in it was shorter than the duration that had actually elapsed. Bell asked him, plainly, whether he was describing a time machine. There was a long pause before Markham answered. He said he did not know if time travel was the right term for it. What the field appeared to do, he said, was disrupt either normal perception or normal reality, and he could not yet determine which of those two things it was. He needed more power and a better stabilization mechanism. Bell pushed back. He repeated his earlier position. Bring in scientists. Work with people who can verify this properly. But by this point, Markham's thinking had taken on a different quality. He had become convinced that he was being watched. He described vehicles parked on his road that he did not recognize, people he felt were monitoring his property, a general atmosphere of surveillance that he could not fully substantiate but was certain about. The call ended with a promise. He would contact Bell again in March. He would have video footage, measurements, and documented evidence of everything he had been describing. That call never came. By March 1997, Markham had gone completely silent. His phone line was disconnected. Letters sent to his address came back unopened. The farmhouse appeared to have been abandoned, and then the garage burned down. Investigators who attended the scene found the same things that would be documented again years later when the case resurfaced. Melted copper, destroyed transformers, and the circular burn pattern on the concrete floor. Nobody. No remains. Just the handwritten note in the metal toolbox. A missing person report was filed. Authorities did not pursue it further. Within months, the story had spread across the early internet. This was the summer of 1997, and online communities dedicated to unexplained events, fringe science, and government conspiracy were already well established. The Mike Markham case landed in that world and immediately took root. Theories multiplied. Some people believed he had succeeded in traveling through time and become stranded somewhere else. Others pointed to the government surveillance he had mentioned in his final call, and suggested the project had been shut down from the outside. Others still believed he had simply died in the fire and that the absence of remains had a mundane explanation that investigators had not bothered to find. Nobody had proof of anything. And then the story got considerably stranger. In 1998, a researcher digging through archived newspaper records came across a short news item from 1930. A body had washed up on a beach in California. The deceased was male, appeared to be in his early 30s, and was wearing clothing that struck the reporting officers as oddly contemporary for the period. More notable was an object found in his pocket, a small rectangular metal device covered in buttons and markings that nobody at the time could identify. When a photograph of this device was enhanced and circulated online, people within the Markham community noticed something that they found difficult to dismiss. The object looked like something a technically minded person from the 1990s might build. The connection was unprovable, but the timing and description were enough to keep the speculation running. Then, in September 2006, a physics professor named Harold Voss, who taught at a small university in Oregon and maintained a blog about fringe and boundary science, opened his email one morning to find a message from a sender he had not expected. The name in the sender field was Mike Markham. The message was brief. Markham said he knew people believed he was dead. He said he was not dead, but that he was not entirely present either. He said the machine had worked, but not in the way he had anticipated. Attached to the email were technical diagrams. Voss, who had the background to assess them, read through the documents carefully. He read the email a second time with his hands shaking, by his own account. The diagrams were far beyond anything Markham had ever described during his radio appearances. Circuit designs, field equations, and detailed warnings about the biological effects of prolonged exposure to the kind of field the device generated. The sophistication of the material was inconsistent with what anyone had previously known about Markham's capabilities. Voss attempted to reply. The message bounced back immediately. He traced the originating IP address to a public library on the island of Kauai in Hawaii. When authorities followed up, nobody at the library had any memory of a visitor matching Markham's description. The trail ended there. Another dead end. Another piece of evidence that raised more questions than it resolved, attached to a man who seemed to have become very good at not being found. In October 2022, a young couple named Andrew and Melanie Carter were in the middle of renovating an old farmhouse they had recently purchased in rural Ohio. The work had been ongoing for several weeks, and on the day in question, Melanie was pulling insulation from the walls of the attic when her hand made contact with something solid behind the material. It was heavier than she expected. She called Andrew up, and together they worked it free from the wall cavity. What came out was a large wooden box, coated in a thick layer of dust that suggested it had been sitting undisturbed for a very long time. Written on the outside in faded handwriting was a label. M. Markham. Do not open until the right time. They opened it on the attic floor. Inside the box were several journals filled from cover to cover with handwritten notes, observations, and circuit diagrams. The dates recorded across the journals spanned from 1995 all the way to 2021. There were circuit boards, some burned and damaged, others in near-perfect condition, each one carefully wrapped in anti-static bags. And there was a Polaroid photograph showing a man standing beside a large ring-shaped metal frame. The date stamp on the photograph read June 21st, 2021. On the back, in the same handwriting as the label on the box, was a single sentence. It did work, but not the way I thought it would. That alone would have been enough to attract attention, but one of the journals contained something that stopped the Carters completely. Written inside was the address of the farmhouse they were currently standing in, their farmhouse, the one they had purchased only recently. Next to the address was a short note: magnetic field stability optimal, safe storage location. They will find it when the time is right. There was no straightforward explanation for how a box hidden years earlier could contain the address of a property that, at the time of writing, may not have been connected to the Carters in any way. They posted about the discovery on Reddit. The post spread quickly, picked up by people who had spent years following the Mike Markham story online. And within days, the thread had drawn significant attention from communities that had long regarded the case as unresolved. 3 weeks after the post went up, Andrew's phone rang. There was no caller ID. The voice on the other end was tired and worn, but those who had listened to the old coast-to-coast AM recordings and later heard descriptions of the call said it was consistent with the voice from those broadcasts. The man identified himself as Mike Markham. He said he had heard that they had found his box. He asked if he could come and explain what had happened. He arrived at the farmhouse on a cool evening later that month. He was 59 years old, which was consistent with his age if he had been aging normally since his disappearance in 1997. But the Carters both noted that he did not look like a man of 59 in any ordinary sense. He looked significantly older than that, weathered in a way that went beyond what years alone could account for. Hollowed out, as though whatever he had been carrying for the past 2.5 decades had worn him down at a level that showed through in every part of him. Over the course of several hours, he told them what had happened. According to Markham, the machine had not moved him through time. That was the fundamental misunderstanding that had shaped how people talked about the case for years, and it was wrong. What the machine had done, he said, was desynchronize him from the people around him. He had remained physically present. He had continued to exist in the same places and the same moments as everyone else. But something in the way other people perceived and processed his existence had been altered. He described it as being like a radio signal that had drifted slightly off its correct frequency. The music was still there, but it was blurred and distant, and the further off frequency it drifted, the harder it became to pick up clearly. He described the night of the fire, March 1997. He had been running the 3rd generation of his machine. The field stabilized in a way it had not done before, and Markham, in what he acknowledged was a reckless decision made in a moment of confidence, stepped fully into it. There was no dramatic physical sensation, no flash of light, no feeling of movement or transition. Just a quiet, deeply uncomfortable sense of disconnection, as though the world around him had shifted slightly in one direction while he had remained where he was. When he stepped back out, the room looked the same, but hours had passed. The machine had overheated during his time inside the field and caught fire. He got out of the building before the fire took hold. Then he tried to contact people, and that was when he understood that something had gone seriously wrong. Friends recognized his face but could not place his name. His landlord had a vague recollection of renting to someone, but could not retain the specific details when pressed. Phone calls went to numbers that registered as disconnected. It was not that people were ignoring him or that he had become invisible in any literal sense. He was there. He could be seen. He could hold a conversation. But something about his presence failed to register and hold in other people's minds the way it had before. He described it as becoming hard to find and hard to remember, as though the part of the brain that normally locks onto a person and retains them could not quite grip him properly. Each time he had subsequently tested the machine on himself, the effect had deepened. He became progressively less real to the people around him in a functional sense. Jobs would not hold because colleagues forgot he worked there. He could not maintain a bank account because the staff who opened it could not retain the memory of having done so. He drifted through years of cash work and temporary accommodation in places where nobody needed to keep a record of him. All the while, he continued researching, trying to understand the mechanism behind what had happened to him. What he eventually concluded was that the machine had not manipulated time in any meaningful certain way. It had manipulated something more fundamental than that. It had interfered with perception, with memory, and with what he described as the quantum probability states that govern whether a person can be observed, acknowledged, and retained in the minds of other conscious beings. His position, as he explained it to the Carters, was that a person's existence is in part dependent on others being able to remember them. Memory, in this framework, is not simply a record of reality, but a component of it, and his capacity to be remembered had been systematically damaged with each exposure to the field. He told them it was getting worse. Each session had compounded the effect. By the time he arrived at their door, he said he could hold coherence in another person's awareness for only a few hours at most before it began to dissolve. The endpoint he was moving towards, if nothing changed, was a state of being completely present, but entirely unperceivable. Alive and physically real, but existing in the gaps between people's attention, with no one able to hold him in mind long enough to acknowledge that he was there. He had planned the visit years in advance. The box had been placed in the wall of that specific property because his research had identified it as a location with optimal magnetic field stability for long-term storage. The address in the journal was not a prediction in any mystical sense. It was the result of deliberate planning, hidden in a place he calculated would be found by the right people at the right time, people who would document everything before the last of his coherence slipped away entirely. Before he left, he made 3 requests. He asked that the journals be sent to a private research archive staffed by people who would study the material seriously without attempting to replicate the experiments carelessly. He asked that the attic be kept locked, as some of the equipment remaining inside it was still magnetically active, and he asked that they make no attempt to contact him again. The Carters agreed. Markham thanked them, stood up from his chair, and walked out through the front door into the night. What happened in the hour that followed is the part of the account that both Andrew and Melanie have returned to repeatedly when describing the experience. The moment he stepped outside, they both noticed that his face was already becoming difficult to hold in their minds. Not in the gradual way that memories normally soften with time, but immediately and actively, as though something was working against their ability to retain what they had just seen. Within minutes, Melanie had picked up a notepad and was writing down everything she could still access because the details were already going. The color of his jacket. Gone. The shape of his hands. Gone. Andrew stood in the kitchen trying to reconstruct the sound of Markham's voice and found he could not do it. Within an hour, they were reading back their own handwriting as though it belonged to someone else. The physical objects in front of them, the notepad, the pen, the coffee stain on the corner of the page, were recognizable as theirs. But the memory that should have given those notes their meaning was thinning out, not disappearing entirely, but becoming vague and structureless, the way a dream recedes in the minutes after waking until only the feeling of it remains, stripped of all its content. In the years since, they have described the encounter as something that feels like it happened to a different person entirely. They know it was real. The journals are there, the Polaroid is there, the notes in Melanie's handwriting are there. But the lived experience of sitting across from Mike Markham, of hearing what he had to say, of looking at his face, has almost completely left them. What remains is the outline of something that was once a memory, holding the shape of an event without any of its substance. Since then, there have been occasional reports. A man matching Markham's general description, asking detailed technical questions in university physics departments. Someone who introduced himself as Mike Markham at a professional conference, whom none of the attendees could remember afterwards. Staff at shelters in several states described a man with deep technical knowledge who never stayed long enough for anyone to learn his name properly. Each report is a little less certain than the one before it. Each witness was a little less sure of what they saw, or whether they saw anything at all.